Hello and welcome everybody to another episode of Books in Bytes. Today we're going to be taking a deep dive into a really interesting book called Narcotic Culture, A History of Drugs in China.
Written by Frank Dikötter, Lars, Laamann, and Zhou.
Yeah, exactly. And we wanted to kind of take this deep dive as a way to give you, our listeners, a chance to sort of get the core arguments and ideas of this book without necessarily having to read the whole thing.
Yeah.
So our kind of mission today is to really unpack some of the maybe surprising history and also some of the kind of revisionist history of opium and other substances in China.
Mm-hmm.
And I think one of the things that's really interesting about this book is that it goes beyond some of the very simplistic understandings of, the opium trade and kind of the role of drugs in Chinese history and society. So before we kind of jump into all of the details, I just want to give you a quick overview of what we're going to be looking at.
Yeah.
So the book challenges this very traditional narrative that China was just a helpless victim of the British opium trade.
Right.
It actually argues that opium, when used in moderation, didn't really have all that many harmful effects.
Mm-hmm.
And maybe even had some benefits in pre-modern China. One of the big arguments of the book is looking at the dangers of prohibition.
Yeah.
And how that can lead to some unintended consequences, and sometimes even the rise of more harmful substances. And then finally, this book really looks at the social and cultural context of drug use in China.
Right.
It goes beyond just these very simple notions of addiction.
Absolutely.
So we're going to be walking you through the book kind of chronologically, looking at all of these different themes in more detail. We're going to be really focusing on the main text itself, not necessarily the editorial parts.
Okay.
And if we have time, we'll even share some of the more famous passages from the book with you.
Sounds good.
Okay, so why don't we jump right in?
All right.
So one of the central arguments that these authors make is that the common understanding of the opium trade, this idea that the British came in and just forced opium on China, is kind of only part of the story. So they say that the failure of the British to grasp the consequences of prohibition is really crucial to understanding the full picture.
Mm-hmm.
So would you say that this is kind of a revisionist history?
Oh, absolutely. This is a very different story than I think a lot of people are familiar with. The authors present a scenario where opium, especially in its early stages, didn't have the detrimental effects on health and longevity that we tend to assume.
Mm-hmm.
And as you mentioned earlier, it was very much integrated into these complex rituals with their own inbuilt constraints.
Okay. So how does this differ then from like the nationalist and missionary narratives that we often hear?
Yeah, well, those narratives really focused on the catastrophic results of the opium trade, painting a picture of China as a helpless victim of this British gunboat policy, and really the book pushes back against that.
Okay.
Suggesting that it's not quite as simple as that.
So let's rewind a bit. Before we even get to the Opium War, what role did opium play in Chinese society and actually even globally?
Yeah. So the book does a really good job of putting the story of opium in a global context. They talk about this psychoactive revolution that kind of happened after the 15th century.
Right.
So you have, the spread of things like tea, coffee, tobacco, various spirits.
Right.
And opium is part of that.
Right.
So it gradually becomes part of this global trade. It's not just a China story.
I see.
And the authors point out that, while the connection between opium and China did become very strong in the popular imagination, in the 19th century, opium was being used in other parts of the world, too, at the time.
Yeah. It's interesting to think of it, I guess, alongside all of these other substances,
Right.
Like tea and coffee that we now think of as very normal and everyday.
Yeah, absolutely. And within China itself, the book points out that, alcoholism was actually relatively low compared to other societies at the time.
Yeah.
So there's this idea that tea, tobacco, and even opium kind of served as these social lubricants in Chinese society.
Okay. So those were the substances that people were turning to for social interaction rather than, alcohol for the most part.
That seems to be the case. Now, opium wasn't a completely new introduction to China at this point. Arab traders had actually brought the poppy to China centuries earlier,
Okay.
but mainly for medicinal use. But when taken orally, it had a really bitter taste.
Oh, I see.
So not very palatable.
So that's what led to smoking it then?
Exactly. So in the 17th century, the Dutch are the ones that introduced the practice of smoking opium, which is known as medak.
Medak, okay.
And this starts in their trading settlements in Taiwan, and then it spreads to the mainland, to Fujian province. So this involved mixing raw opium with tobacco, sometimes other substances as well.
Mm-hmm.
And what's interesting is that the early smoking houses in Taiwan, they would actually give people free samples.
Hmm.
So the first smoke was free, and they'd often provide food and desserts as well.
Wow.
So, really establishing these social customs around its use.
Yeah, free opium. Sounds like a pretty good marketing strategy.
Yeah, definitely a way to get people hooked.
Yeah.
So how did the Chinese authorities react to this early trend?
Yeah, that's a good question.
Well, the Qing authorities, they did express concerns quite early on. They saw opium smoking as this kind of evil, this potentially harmful evil that was spreading along the southeast coast. And they were worried about its influence on good families. And the language they used even echoes the language of edicts against heresy.
Oh, wow.
So there's this concern about, these gatherings happening at night in opium houses and a kind of social decay.
I see. So from this initial stage of medax smoking, how do we get to this, more widespread opium use?
Right.
That eventually becomes so intertwined with the Opium War.
Yeah, so in the period leading up to that, you have the British East India Company, and they're initially somewhat cautious because the king had actually prohibited the smoking of opium back in 1729.
Okay.
But medicinal opium was still legal.
Right.
However, the company's trading colonies in Southeast Asia, they were creating this really competitive environment for opium distribution.
Okay. So then the Opium War itself, is it really just about Britain forcing opium on China, as we're often taught?
Right, and that's where the book offers a really interesting alternative perspective.
Yeah.
So what they point out is that the expulsion of foreign merchants in 1820 actually led to an increase in opium smuggling.
Oh, wow.
So, trying to crack down on it actually made it worse.
Wow.
The trade was incredibly lucrative, and the East India Company, they got very involved with Malwa opium, which is produced in India.
Okay.
They even started buying it up to try to control competition with their own Bengal opium.
So they wanted to kind of corner the market.
Yeah, exactly. And then when the company's monopoly on trade ends in 1833, you have this wave of private entrepreneurs, these ambitious people who just ignore the king trade restrictions on a whole range of goods, opium being a major one.
Okay, so what about the traditional understanding that, massive opium imports created a huge trade deficit for China, and that's what ultimately led to the war?
Yeah, well, it is true that there was a global economic downturn that affected China.
Right.
But the book points to recent scholarship that suggests that official opinions within the king court were actually quite divided
Okay.
on just how responsible opium payments were for the outflow of silver. Some officials even argued in favor of legalizing the trade
Oh, wow.
to try to control it better and even generate some revenue from it.
Interesting.
The book actually cites the work of James Polacek, and he kind of hypothesizes that if those voices had prevailed, the Opium War might never have happened.
Wow.
So it really makes you think.
Yeah, that's a very different interpretation than I think a lot of people have heard. So then, after the Opium War, how does opium fit into the lives of ordinary Chinese people?
So moving into this period that the book calls Opium for the People, roughly from 1840 to 1940,
Okay.
we see opium taking on these really diverse functions. It's a medical product, used for pain relief, all sorts of ailments. But it's also a recreational item, a status symbol for the elites. It's even part of cultural practices. The book compares it to the tea ceremony, the preparation rituals.
Wow.
What's interesting is that the authors contrast the Chinese ritual of smoking opium, which was very involved, with the much simpler European methods of ingesting it.
Okay.
And they suggest that this might have actually contributed to lower rates of problematic use in China.
So that the ritual itself almost had built-in control mechanisms.
Yeah, potentially.
Interesting. Were there different kinds of opium being used?
Oh, yeah. You had imported varieties like Patna, Benares, Malwa, Persian opium,
Wow.
all available, each with their own characteristics.
Okay.
Different aroma, price points. Connoisseurs can even distinguish between them.
I see.
Now, it's difficult to get exact figures on how much opium people were consuming.
Right.
But the book does share observations from that time, And they point out that many people, even regular users of opium, they didn't seem to suffer these really severe health consequences that we tend to think of. There are even descriptions of, hardy peasantry, healthy, energetic, who also use opium.
I see. So it really goes against that image of the wasted addict.
Right. It wasn't necessarily this immediately debilitating substance.
Yeah, and it sounds like it wasn't just, something done in secret, but it was actually incorporated into social life.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
So people would use opium at social events,
Yeah.
funerals, weddings, feasts. And the book really challenges this idea of a universal loss of control among smokers. They argue that, locally produced opium was relatively affordable,
Okay.
and people could kind of adjust their consumption. So it didn't necessarily lead to financial ruin for most people.
Right.
And even some medical opinions at the time suggested that moderate smoking was relatively harmless because the process of burning the opium actually reduced its potency.
Oh, interesting. And then you mentioned the preparation ritual itself, which also sounds quite elaborate.
Yeah, this is a whole process.
Mm-hmm.
It's known as Zhuangyan.
Zhuangyin.
Yeah, proper opium preparation,
Yeah.
sometimes involving a dedicated individual.
Oh, wow.
The book even describes this person as an opium sous chef.
Wow. So really an expert in how to prepare it.
Yeah, exactly. And then what's really interesting is that the book recounts how Western visitors like W. Somerset Maugham, when they visited opium houses, they were surprised by the atmosphere.
Mm-hmm.
So they describe these places as being quite calm and social, quite different from, the dens of iniquity that they had imagined.
Right.
Maugham even compares them favorably to Western beer houses. John Blofeld had a similar experience. He says it wasn't the hell that he had imagined. And opium houses also served as these cheap hostels for migrants.
Okay.
So, offering a bit of respite from their difficult lives.
So it almost sounds like opium in that context served a variety of social needs and even practical needs.
Yeah, that's a really good point.
Yeah.
The book also touches on the use of opium in suicides. They point out that it was a relatively common method, although it did become less common with the introduction of modern poisons. And they also talk about the issue of adulteration. So opium paste would sometimes be mixed with other substances, some of which were actually harmful.
Okay, so we've talked about the social aspects.
Yeah.
You mentioned earlier that opium was used as a medical product as well.
Mm-hmm.
How widespread was that?
Yeah, so this leads us to a really fascinating section of the book. It's called The Best Possible and Sure Shield, Opium Disease and Epidemics.
Okay.
And the authors argue that a primary motivation for smoking opium was actually self-medication.
Okay.
So using it to alleviate pain, reduce fevers, suppress coughs.
So it actually worked in those areas.
Oh, it was very effective. So it acted as a painkiller, fever reducer, cough suppressant. And opium had a long history of medical use in China. It was even used against serious diseases like cholera and malaria,
Wow.
sometimes proving more effective than the available Western medicine at the time.
So it wasn't just about, getting high. There was this very serious element of self-treatment involved.
Absolutely. And the book points out that, especially before the advent of modern pharmaceuticals, opium played this really important role in people's lives.
Right.
They are careful to point out that it wasn't a cure-all.
Of course.
It wasn't effective against every disease. And they also talk about the rise of this anti-opium sentiment and the increasingly negative portrayal of the addict that you start to see coming from foreign missionaries and political elites.
Right. So that leads us then to these debates about prohibition, led by the missionaries, right?
Exactly. So the section called The Horrors, Missionary Debates on Prohibition, really reveals that opinions on opium use were actually quite diverse among different missionary groups.
Okay.
So, for example, the Royal Commission on Opium in 1892, they concluded, and this was a surprise at the time, that the evidence didn't really support this idea of a massive opium plague.
Oh, interesting.
However, over time, a more critical view does become dominant.
Yeah.
Particularly among these medical missionaries. They increasingly portray opium as this tool of the devil and this major obstacle to spreading Christianity.
I see.
And what's interesting is that some health officials in the foreign concessions actually viewed alcohol as a more significant public health problem than opium.
Really? So even within the West, there wasn't this kind of unified perspective on opium in China?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So you have groups like the Society for the Suppression of the Opium Trade who are really pushing for prohibition. The book also looks at Chinese perspectives on opium's effects. They talk about the withdrawal symptoms, which are known as yin.
Yin.
And they also mention this kind of skepticism about the newly coined term opium craving, which came from the West. But this idea of an uncontrollable addiction.
Right.
And so anti-opium propaganda, it increasingly portrays smokers as these helpless victims, physically and morally degenerate. They link opium use to all sorts of social ills, even racial decline. And so the image of the opium house shifts dramatically from this social gathering place to this site of perdition. And this growing anti-opium sentiment, fueled by nationalism, the global anti-drug movement, leads to official prohibition in Republican China. although enforcement is often inconsistent.
Okay, so what are the consequences then when prohibition actually starts to be enforced?
Yeah, so the section called Curing the Addict, Prohibition and Detoxification, looks at the unintended outcomes of these efforts to stamp out opium. So you have this kind of unlikely alliance between some missionary groups and nationalist elites
Okay.
who are promoting prohibition and this idea of a cure for addiction. So detoxification centers and opium treatment hospitals begin to appear.
Wow.
They even try opium replacement medicines that contain caffeine. But these treatment centers often had very low success rates,
Oh, wow.
and the potential medical benefits of opium were largely ignored.
Right.
And the criminalization of opium use under the Kuomintang led to overcrowded prisons.
So it sounds like the reality of prohibition was quite different from the ideal.
Yeah, very much so. The book describes, these often dehumanizing routines in detoxification centers. They talk about this social divide. So wealthy opium users are often left alone, while the poor are really the main targets of enforcement. And this image of the emaciated addict, that was widely circulated, that didn't really reflect the reality of many moderate users who were often indistinguishable from the general population.
Right.
The methods used to detect opium use were also flawed. And there was this limited understanding of the actual physiological effects of smoking opium. And some of the detoxification methods that they used, like the blister method or serum injections, were actually really harmful and led to patient deaths.
Oh, wow.
And even some anti-opium institutions acknowledged that opium was actually effective at treating symptoms of some common ailments like tuberculosis.
So even they had to admit that it had some benefits.
Yeah, it's a real mixed bag.
So despite maybe the good intentions behind prohibition, it seems like it also created a whole new set of problems.
Absolutely. And the section called The Spread of Semi-Synthetic Opiates details how opium prohibition actually inadvertently paved the way for morphine and heroin,
Okay.
these cheaper and more potent alternatives.
Oh, wow.
So morphine use increases initially as a prescription drug, and then heroin, which was actually marketed by some as this non-addictive substitute for morphine.
Wow.
It quickly gains popularity for recreational use before eventually being outlawed in many regions.
Okay.
And then you have the emergence of these red pills,
Red pills.
which were heroin pills mixed with other substances,
Okay.
like strychnine and caffeine. And these became a real phenomenon. And the National Anti-Opium Association of China, they actually observed that the illegal trade and use of morphine, heroin, and even cocaine increased as opium smoking decreased.
Really? Wow.
So, prohibition had this unintended consequence.
It's almost like trying to eliminate one thing just made space for something even worse. Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And then you start to see these local clandestine factories producing heroin, sometimes involving high-ranking officials and gangsters.
Wow. So it really became embedded in the criminal underworld.
Yeah, and you have to remember that this wasn't uniform across China.
Mm-hmm.
There were regional variations. In some areas, opium remained dominant.
Mm-hmm.
In others, you see these semi-synthetics really taking hold.
Okay.
And the book also has a section called Needle Culture,
Okay.
which talks about how the hypodermic syringe arrives in China,
Mm.
and it's quickly adopted.
Wow.
Partly because people are looking for these quick cures, and there was this kind of existing needle lore from acupuncture.
Right. So needles weren't this completely foreign concept.
Exactly. And there's this enthusiasm for injections
Mm-hmm.
as this modern medical intervention, which sometimes led to, excessive and unscientific use.
Right.
And then you also have the dangers of unsterilized needles causing infections or other health problems. And this is particularly true among, poor morphine injectors.
So it's almost like you had this clash between traditional practices and, the allure of modern medicine.
Yeah, definitely. And then, under Japanese occupation, there were these dope huts operating where morphine injections were very common.
Wow.
And you see certain groups like rickshaw pullers who become frequent users of injected morphine.
For energy, I imagine.
Yeah, exactly. To try to keep going, to work these incredibly long hours. So it's really a fascinating but also quite sad story.
Yeah. So what about other drugs in China during this period?
Well, the book has this section called China's Other Drugs, and it talks about cannabis.
Okay.
And what's really interesting is that cannabis doesn't seem to have had much social significance in China compared to other parts of the world.
Okay.
They speculate that maybe this had to do with negative perceptions of its smell.
I see.
And so it never really gained this widespread consumer demand or medical approval or even any political opposition.
Okay.
It seems like consumers in China preferred sedatives like opium, morphine, heroin, rather than stimulants or hallucinogens.
So cannabis just never really took off. And the book also makes this really interesting point about how the commodity that benefited most from opium prohibition was actually the cigarette.
Oh, yeah. That's
It
fascinating.
becomes the symbol of modernity,
Mm-hmm.
and it overtakes opium and other forms of tobacco use.
Mhm.
So you see this rapid spread of foreign cigarettes
Right.
across all social classes. People are using them as social gestures.
Yeah. So in a way, it fills the void left by opium.
Yeah. So I guess if we had to summarize, what are the main takeaways from this book, from Narcotic Culture?
Yeah.
What would you say are the most important things for our listeners to remember?
Well, I think the overarching message is that the history of drugs in China is far more complex than just this simple story of, British imposition and Chinese victimhood.
Mm-hmm.
The book forces us to think about the social and cultural contexts surrounding drug use and the often overlooked benefits and rituals associated with opium, and the unintended consequences of prohibition policies, which were often really negative.
Yeah, and those unintended consequences are so important.
Yeah, absolutely. One really striking argument the book makes is that moderate opium use, contrary to popular belief, initially had very few harmful effects.
Wow. Okay.
And then they also depict opium houses not just as these dens of addiction, but often as these social spaces that filled various needs within the community.
So for you, or a listener, as you think about this history, how do you think different cultural contexts shape our understanding of drug use and also the impact of drug use? And what lessons do you think we can learn from the unintended consequences of past drug policies, especially when we think about our current approach to drugs around the world?
Yeah, those are really crucial questions.
Yeah, and ones that this book really makes us think about.
Absolutely. Not just about China's history, but about how we think about drug use and drug regulation globally.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So we really encourage you to check out Narcotic Culture for yourself. If you want to really dig deep and explore all the nuances of this really fascinating history.
Yeah, it's definitely worth a read.
All right. Well, thank you for joining us for this deep dive.
Thanks for having me.